She couldn't run. She couldn't fight. She had a broken leg, a minimum wage job, and absolutely nothing to offer a man who owned half the city's criminal empire. But when he pointed his gun at a terrified 19-year-old girl, she stepped in front of it anyway. What happened next didn't just change her life, it shattered everything Victor Kane thought he knew about power, loyalty, and what's actually worth protecting. This channel is where mafia bosses meet their match stories of dangerous love, unbreakable family bonds, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who change everything. Because this story reminds us that true strength was never about how fast you can run, it's about choosing to stand still when everyone else walks away. If that speaks to you, hit like, drop a comment telling me who you think was braver, Lantel, Ian, or Victor. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
You know, the funny thing you remember about a moment like that isn't the fear, it's the little things. The gun against my skin was so cold. Victor Kane's voice was just as cold. "Give me one reason," he said, "why I shouldn't redecorate this place with your boss's problems." Running wasn't an option for me, not with this leg of mine. But as the whole diner fell apart, chairs turning over, people screaming, and poor young Emma frozen solid, I did the one thing my body still could. I just fell, right at the feet of the most powerful man in the city. "I can't run," I whispered up at him, and I saw something flicker in those icy eyes of his. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything started to change. It all began on just another night, under the buzzing lights of Sal's diner. They'd been flickering for 3 weeks straight. Sal, bless his heart, promised he'd get to it, but he was one man trying to keep a business afloat. I'd stopped seeing the stuttering yellow light that made everyone look a little haunted. I just moved through my shift, my left leg dragging the way it always did. A permanent souvenir from a drunk driver who ran a red light 4 years before. 3 surgeries and a bunch of metal pins later, I had a limp that told me when it was going to rain. "Table nine's out of ketchup," Marcus called from the grill. He flipped burgers like a machine. He'd been at Sal's for 15 years, and you could see every single one of them in the lines around his eyes. "Sal's locked himself in the office again," he added. My hand tightened on the coffee pot. "How long?" I asked. "An hour and a half." That was bad. A locked office meant calls Sal didn't want us to hear, the kind that made his hands shake. "Any idea what it's about?" I kept my voice low. Marcus just gave me this look, halfway between pity and fear. "Money," he said. "What else?" The dinner crowd had thinned out to the regulars. There was old Joe, turning his coffee into a dessert at the counter, and Dale the trucker working on a piece of pie. And then there was Emma, our newest waitress, wiping down spotless tables. She needed every hour she could get. She was only 19. She had this energy that reminded me of myself at her age, before the accident, before I learned the world doesn't wait for you to heal. "You okay?" Emma popped up beside me, her young face full of a concern that made her look even younger. "Fine, just tired." "You're always tired," she said, grabbing a rag. "You're limping more than usual. Maybe you should sit down." Just then, the front door swung open. 3 men walked in, and it was like the temperature dropped 20 degrees. They wore suits that cost more than I made. In 6 months, tailored so perfectly it hurt to look. But it wasn't the suits that made my stomach twist. It was the way they carried themselves, like predators who knew they were in a cage full of mice. The man in the lead was maybe in his early 30s, handsome in a terrifying sort of way. Sharp cheekbones, cold blue eyes. He scanned our little diner like he was looking at something he'd scraped off his shoe. "We're here to see Sal." It wasn't a question. His voice was smooth, but it had an edge. Marcus froze mid-flip. Emma went white as a sheet. Even old Joe found the bottom of his coffee cup fascinating. I found my voice somehow. "He's in a meeting right now. Can I—" "You can get him," the man said, his smile all sharp angles. Now would be good. I'll go, Emma whispered, but I grabbed her wrist. A powerful instinct told me to keep that girl as far away from these men as possible. I'll handle it. I limped toward the office, feeling their eyes on my broken walk. Every step felt like an admission of weakness. The door was thin. I could hear Sal's voice, high and desperate. I know I'm late, he was saying, but I just need one more week, I swear. I knocked softly. Sal? After a moment of scrambling, the door cracked open. His face was gray and sweaty. He looked a decade older than he had that morning. There are men here for you, I said quietly. His eyes fluttered shut, like he'd just been handed a death sentence. Tell them 5 minutes. Please, Lena. When I walked back out, the men had spread out, blocking the exits. The leader stood in the center of the room like he owned it. Emma was trying to become invisible behind the register. He needs 5 minutes, I told him. He's had 3 months, the man replied, glancing at a watch that probably cost more than my car. Time's up. Look, I don't know what this is about, but… No, he cut me off. You don't. So I suggest you go back to your coffee pots and let the grown-ups talk. A hot flash of anger went through me. For years I'd been dismissed because of my leg, my job. I usually just let it go. But something about this man, the casual cruelty in his voice, lit a fuse inside me. This is a diner, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. So either order something or you can leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the faulty lights seemed to hold their breath. The man turned his head slowly and studied me. What's your name? Lena. Lena, he repeated like he was tasting the word. Do you have any idea who I am? Should I? One of his men chuckled. My name, the leader said, each word landing like a stone, is Victor Kane. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Even in my small world, I knew that name. Victor Kane. The boogeyman in $1,000 suit who ran the city's shadows. The man powerful people pretended not to know, and I had just told him to order a coffee or get out. I see you've heard of me. Victor's smile was pure steel. Good. That saves us some time. Here's how this is going to go. Sal will walk out of that office with the $50,000 he owes me, plus interest. And then we will leave. Simple. No one gets hurt. $50,000. The number barely registered. I had about $700 to my name. And if he doesn't have it? I heard myself ask. Then things get messy, Victor said, his tone casual. And nobody wants that. As if on cue, the office door opened. Sal came out, looking like he'd aged a lifetime in the last 20 minutes. His shirt was soaked, his hands shaking so badly he had to hold onto the door frame. Mr. Kane, he stammered. I know I'm late. I just need a little more time. 2 more weeks, I swear. You needed 3 months, Sal. I gave you 3 months. Business has been slow. The freezer broke. The inspector. Not my problem. Victor's voice never rose, which was somehow much more terrifying. Do you have any idea what would happen if I let every deadbeat business owner pay me when they felt like it? Please, Sal begged, and it was hard to watch. I have money, not all of it. I have $30,000 in the safe. It's more than half. Just give me 2 more weeks. 2 weeks becomes 2 months. 2 months becomes never. Victor's eyes were like chips of ice. You think I built my entire enterprise by being sentimental? I'll get it, I swear on my life. Your life, Victor mused, tilting his head. An interesting piece of collateral. He moved then, a smooth, unhurried motion, and suddenly a gun was in his hand. It wasn't aimed, but its presence sucked all the air out of the room. I heard Emma make a small, choked sound. Here's my counteroffer, Victor said calmly. You give me the $30,000 now, and to make up for the rest. His gaze swept the diner, then it landed and stayed, right on Emma. Her. You know, it's funny how a single moment can just stop. Everything just freezes. That's what it felt like when he said he was going to take her. The word no just burst out of me, darling, before I even had a chance to think. No, you can't, I remember saying. She's just a kid. And him, so cold, he said, she's an asset. Like he was talking about a chair. Said she was young, pretty, and poor, and that plenty of places would pay good money for a girl like that. Before I knew it, I was moving. My legs were screaming, but I didn't care. I just planted myself right between him, Victor Kane, and little Emma, my arms out wide. Can you believe it? Like I could actually stop a man who built an entire empire on being scary. Touch her, I said, and my voice was shaking something awful, a mix of terror and anger, and something I guess you could call courage. And you'll have to go through me first. For about 3 seconds, the world held its breath. Then he laughed. Oh, it was a terrible sound. He was truly amused, but there was this darkness underneath it, the kind that told you he'd seen this all before and knew exactly how it would end. He slid his gun back into its holster, slow as molasses, just to prove a point. You're going to stop me? He asked. If I have to, I said. Sal, my boss, whispered. Lena, don't. Please, just look at you. Victor took a step closer, and every part of me wanted to run, but I stood my ground. You can barely stand, he said, his eyes on my trembling legs. You're terrified. What exactly do you think you're going to do? And I looked him right in the eye and said, whatever it takes. He was so close then, I could see this tiny scar through his eyebrow and smell the cologne he wore. Probably cost more than my rent. But what I remember most was the total lack of fear in his eyes. He was a man who'd never been afraid of anyone. Brave, he said, looking right into me. Incredibly stupid, but brave. Then his hand shot out, so fast, and grabbed my arm. It wasn't hard enough to leave a mark, just enough to show me how powerless I really was, to make his point. And then he pulled. Of course, my bad leg buckled instantly. It always did when my weight shifted wrong, when that old injury decided to remind me that I was broken. I went down hard, barely getting my hands out in time to stop my face from smacking the dirty floor. The pain, sweetheart, it was like lightning shooting up my back. I ended up on the cold floor, right at his feet, looking up at this man who could ruin my life with a single phone call. Please, I whispered. It was all I had left. All the fight was gone, just desperation. Please, I can't run. I can't fight. I can't do anything. But don't take her. She's 19 years old. She has a little brother to take care of. She's saving up for community college. Please. For a long moment, the only sounds were the buzz of the overhead lights and Emma crying behind the counter. He just stared down at me, and I couldn't read his face at all. It was a complete mask. Then he asked the strangest thing. What happened to your leg? It was so out of the blue I almost didn't answer. Car accident, 4 years ago. And you still work on your feet every night. I don't have a choice, I told him. He said, everyone has choices. But his voice, it had changed. Just a tiny bit. It was a little softer now. I could hear it. You could have stayed quiet, he went on. Let me take her, saved yourself. But you didn't. No, I said. Why not? My voice cracked then. Because she's 19. Because she reminds me of who I used to be. Because nobody helped me when I needed it. And I won't let that happen to someone else if I can stop it. He knelt, bringing himself down to my level. And up close like that, I saw his eyes weren't really cold. They were guarded. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to hide everything human so deep inside, you could only see little pieces of it. What's your name? He asked again, like the answer suddenly meant something. Lena Hayes. Lena Hayes, he repeated, almost like he was memorizing it. How long have you worked here? 3 years. You have family? That question hurt more than falling down. No, just me now. He stood up so fast it startled me and turned to Sal. The safe. Open it. Now. Sal nearly fell over himself to do it, his hands shaking so much he dropped the money twice. All these crumpled 50s and hundreds fell onto the counter. $30,000 in dirty cash, probably every penny that diner had made in a year. Victor didn't even look at it. He just took out his phone, typed something, and waited. 30 seconds later, the door opened, and one of his men came in with a leather briefcase that looked like it cost a fortune. He set it on the counter and opened it. And inside, honey, was more money than I had ever seen in my life. Just stacks and stacks of clean, crisp $100 bills. Count out 50,000, Victor said. Put it in the safe. We all just stared, completely lost. I said, count it out. His voice turned to steel. Now. The man did as he was told, pulling out stack after stack of money and putting it in Sal's old safe. All you could hear was the rustle of bills filling up the diner. It should have been a wonderful sound, but it just felt strange, like I was in someone else's dream. When he was done, Victor looked at Sal. Your debt is paid, he said. In full. The interest, too. Sal's mouth just opened and closed like a fish. What? Emma's voice was just a little whisper. What is this? Consider it a gift, Victor said, and then his eyes found me, still on the floor. From the girl who can't run, but stood anyway. And then he just walked out. His men followed him like shadows, and the door chimed, this happy, normal sound that was so out of place. The silence they left behind was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Marcus was the first to move. He ran over and gently helped me up. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? I'm fine, I said, even though my leg was throbbing. I'm fine. Sal just collapsed into a booth, bless his heart, staring at that open safe like the money might just vanish. I don't understand, he kept saying. Why would he? I don't know, I said, leaning on the counter. I don't know. Then Emma just threw her arms around my neck and sobbed right into my shoulder. You saved me. You saved my life. I didn't do anything, I told her. You stood up to him. She pulled back, tears all over her sweet face. Nobody stands up to Victor Kane. Nobody. But I had. And somehow, impossibly, I was still standing there. The rest of that shift was a total blur. Sal kept poking the money, Marcus kept asking if I was okay, and Emma just kept crying and thanking me. By sunrise, it felt like the whole world knew. People came into the diner just to look, to see the place Victor Kane had saved, to see the waitress who had faced him down and lived. I just kept cleaning tables and pouring coffee, trying to act like my life hadn't just been turned completely upside down. I was wiping down a counter when Marcus came up beside me, looking worried. You need to be careful, he said, so quietly. What do you mean? Men like Victor Kane, he said. They don't do things for free. There's always a price. He said it was a gift. Nothing's a gift in his world. Marcus kept glancing at the door, like he expected Victor to just walk right back in. Whatever he wants from you, just be careful, please. I nodded, but I was already thinking the same thing. Men like him weren't merciful. That meant he wanted something. I just didn't know what. 3 days later, right in the middle of the lunch rush, a man in a very expensive suit walked in. He was younger than Victor, maybe 30, with this slick, professional smile. He ordered a coffee he never touched and just waited until my section cleared out a bit. Miss Hayes, he said, walking over. My name is James Carter. I work for Mr. Kane. Of course he did. I put down the coffee pot. What does he want? To offer you an opportunity. He pointed to an empty booth. May I? Every bone in my body screamed no, but my leg was aching something fierce from working a double, and I was just too curious. So I sat down. James took out a business card. You know, the fancy kind, thick paper with raised letters, the kind that costs a lot of money. Mr. Kane was impressed by what he saw the other night, he said. Your courage, Your loyalty to someone you barely knew. He'd like to help you. Help me how? By giving you a chance to walk again without pain. Those words, honey, they just hit me like a ton of bricks. My hand went right to my bad leg, hidden under my uniform. That's not possible, I told him straight. I've seen specialists. The damage is permanent. You've seen the specialists your insurance paid for, he said, leaning in. The ones who just patch you up. Mr. Kane has access to the best surgeons in the world, experimental treatments, physical therapy that actually works. He's willing to cover everything, the surgery, recovery, all of it. Why? The word just flew out of my mouth. Why would he do that? Because he can. And because he wants to. Nobody does something like that for free, I said. You're absolutely right, he said, without even a flicker of hesitation. In exchange, he'd like your time. Once a week, you'll have dinner with Mr. Kane. Conversation, company, nothing more. I just stared at him. That's it? Dinner? That's it, he said. I don't believe you. I understand why you'd be skeptical. He pulled out another card. This one had a doctor's name on it. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the top orthopedic surgeons in the country. She's expecting you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for a consultation. Go. Hear what she has to say. Get a real opinion on your leg. Then you can decide. And if I say no to the dinner? I asked. You know that Mr. Carter always had a way with words. He'd say, Mr. Kane doesn't force anyone, and he said it with such practiced ease, buttoning his jacket just so that you'd almost believe him. But he laid out my life right there, you see. A future where I wouldn't be in pain, where I could walk without that awful limp, without people staring, without that constant fear in the back of my mind that my leg would just give out one day. And all Mr. Kane wanted was a few hours of my time each week, just to talk to someone who didn't want anything from him but his honesty. He left her card on the table and just walked out. I must have sat there for 20 minutes, just staring at it. Dr. Sarah Chen. The chance to walk again. All for the price of dinner with a crime boss once a week. It was a crazy, dangerous idea, probably some kind of trap. But that night, honey, lying in my cramped little apartment with my leg throbbing through the painkillers, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About walking without pain, about not having to plan every single step, about maybe, just maybe, having a normal life again. At 2 in the morning, I called the number. A receptionist answered on the second ring, so professional, not at all surprised. Dr. Chen's office, how may I help you? I just managed to say, my name is Lena Hayes. I was told to call about an appointment. And she said, of course, Miss Hayes. We have you scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. The consultation will take about 2 hours. Do you need directions? I remember saying, no, wait, I haven't confirmed yet. And she said, with such warmth in her voice, Mr. Kane was quite confident you would call. Shall we see you at 10? I should have just hung up the phone. I should have said no. But I heard myself say, yes, 10 a.m. Excellent. We'll see you then, she said. And the line went dead. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering what in the world I had just agreed to. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was in a part of the city I never went to. The buildings were all gleaming glass and steel, and the people wore designer clothes like armor. It was the kind of place where poverty was just an idea, something they'd designed away. Her medical center was on the top 3 floors of a skyscraper, and the waiting room looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. I almost turned right around, but the receptionist spotted me. And then Dr. Chen herself came out. She was a woman in her 50s with the kindest eyes, graying hair and a simple bun, and she just had this air about her. You knew she was brilliant at her job. Lena Hayes, she said, offering her hand. I'm Sarah Chen, come with me. Come. The examination was the most thorough I'd ever had. X-rays, an MRI, tests, so many questions about the accident, the surgeries, the pain. And she listened, really listened, asking things that showed she actually cared. Finally, she sat back in her chair with her tablet and just studied my scans for a long moment. Your original surgeons did solid work, she said carefully. Given what they had to work with, they saved your leg and got you walking. That's a real achievement. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? They stabilized you. They didn't restore you. Dr. Chen pulled up an image, pointing to things I didn't understand. There's significant scar tissue here. The pins are adequate, but not optimal. And this area, she said, highlighting a section, there's nerve damage that was never properly addressed. I remember my voice was barely a whisper when I asked, "Can you fix it?" Dr. Chen looked right at me. "I think so. It would mean 3 surgeries over 18 months, with a lot of physical therapy in between. And I won't lie, it will be painful. Recovery is hard work. But if you're willing to do the work," she paused, "I believe I can get you to about 90% of full function. Maybe 95. 90%. For 4 years, I thought I was stuck at 50% for life." "How much would it cost?" I asked. She named a number that made the room swim. "6 figures," she said. "Maybe even 7 by the end of it all." "Mr. Kane has agreed to cover all expenses," Dr. Chen went on. "Surgery, therapy, medications, everything. You wouldn't pay a dime." "In exchange for what?" I had to ask. That was the big question, wasn't it? Her expression never changed. "That's between you and him, but I will tell you this. I've worked with Mr. Kane's organization before. He's funded treatments for people who couldn't afford them, and to my knowledge, he's never asked for anything inappropriate in return." I pushed back a little. "To your knowledge?" She met my gaze and said, "I'm a mandatory reporter, Lena. If I suspected anything illegal or coercive, I'd be required to report it. I haven't. That should tell you something." I left her office with a folder and a spinning head. I walked for hours, my bad leg aching, just turning it all over in my mind. 90%. No more pain, no more limp. All for the price of dinner with Victor Kane once a week. It was insane. But so was spending the rest of my life like this, barely getting by, working myself into the ground just to watch my body slowly fail me. That evening, I called James Carter. He answered right away. "Miss Hayes," he said. I didn't waste any time. "I want to know why. The real reason, not some polite story." "Why me?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I think Mr. Kane should answer that himself. Your first dinner is Friday night. A car will pick you up at 7. I remember saying, "I haven't agreed yet." And his voice was so calm when he replied, "Haven't you?" He was right, of course. I'd agreed the moment I walked out of that doctor's office with that tiny flicker of hope. "Fine," I said. "Friday at 7. Excellent. One more thing, Miss Hayes. Mr. Kane values honesty above all else. Whatever questions you have, ask them. He'll appreciate your directness." The line went dead. I stood in my little apartment, phone still in my hand, just staring at my own reflection in the dark window. I just agreed to have dinner with the most dangerous man in the city, and I had no idea what I was getting into. Friday showed up feeling like destiny. I stood in front of my closet, if you could even call that little alcove a closet, staring at clothes that were all wrong for dinner with a man who ran half the city's underworld. I owned exactly one nice dress. A simple black one I'd bought for my mother's funeral 3 years before. It would have to do. The car arrived at 7 exactly. A sleek black sedan with windows so dark, I couldn't see inside. The driver was a man in his 40s who opened my door without a word and just waited, with the kind of patience that comes from doing the same thing 1,000 times. I hesitated on the curb for a moment. My leg was throbbing after a shift that had run 2 hours long. "Miss Hayes," the driver said quietly, "Mr. Kane doesn't like to be kept waiting." So, I got in. The inside smelled of leather and money, you know? That specific smell of wealth that comes from things that are just unnecessarily expensive. The seats were heated, and there was classical music playing softly from some hidden speakers. It was the kind of car that made you aware of every little flaw in your own life. We drove through the city as the sun went down, leaving my neighborhood behind for places I'd only seen in movies. Mansions set far back from the road, behind gates that probably cost more than I made in a decade. The trees were all planted in perfect rows, like soldiers guarding the rich. The restaurant didn't have a sign, just a shiny black door between two perfectly sculpted bushes. A valet appeared out of nowhere the second we stopped, greeting my driver by name. Inside, it was all hushed and elegant. Low amber light, fresh flowers on every table, and the kind of quiet that only comes from a lot of money. A hostess, wearing a dress that likely cost 2 months of my rent, led me through the main dining room without a word, her heels clicking on the marble floors. We walked past tables of people who looked like they were born in that world. Men in perfect suits and women just sparkling with jewels. You know, not one of them even glanced our way. I was completely invisible. The hostess took me to a private room at the back, behind this enormous wooden door. She knocked, opened it, and waved me in. And there he was. Victor Kane stood up when I entered. He didn't look like he did at the diner. The hard edges were gone, at least for the night. He'd taken off his jacket, and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows. I could see all these muscles and a bit of a tattoo on his left wrist. The gun was still there, I was sure of it. But just for a moment, he seemed almost normal. Almost. "Lena," he said, pointing to a chair. "Thank you for coming." I sat down, trying not to wince from my leg. Did I have a choice? You always have a choice. He moved so smoothly back into his chair, just completely at ease. You could have said no, stayed home, ignored me, and if I had, I would have respected that. His eyes met mine, and I remember thinking how much he held back behind them. "I'm many things, Lena, but I'm not a liar. When I say something, I mean it." A waiter appeared out of nowhere, so quiet and quick, and poured wine. He was gone before I could even say no. "I don't drink," I told him. "Then don't." Victor picked up his glass but didn't take a sip, but you looked like you needed to do something with your hands. He was right about that. My knuckles were white from gripping the table. "You have questions," Victor said. It wasn't really a question. "Ask." So I did. "Why are you doing all of this? The debt, the surgery? What do you want from me?" "I told you, dinner once a week. Nobody spends that kind of money just for conversation." "I do." He set his glass down and leaned in a little. "Do you know what my life is like, Lena? Every single day I'm surrounded by people who want something. Money, power, favors. They lie right to my face and think I'm a fool. They smile at me while plotting behind my back. They tell me what they think I want to hear, never the truth." He stopped for a second. "And then there's you. What about me? You threw yourself between me and a girl you barely knew. No ulterior motive. No thought of what you might gain. You just did it because you thought it was right." His voice got softer then. "Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world?" "That wasn't bravery," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That was just desperation." "Maybe. But it was real." Victor's gaze was so intense I almost had to look away. "And I haven't seen anything real in a very long time." The waiter brought appetizers then, tiny little works of art on plates, things I'd never seen before. "So what?" I asked, staring at the food. "I'm supposed to be your weekly dose of authenticity?" "Something like that." Victor picked up a fork. "I spend my days making decisions that impact thousands of people. Decisions that mean I have to think 10 steps ahead, consider every possibility, and trust no one. It's draining. And then I meet someone who doesn't work that way, who just acts from her gut without weighing the costs." He paused. "I find that fascinating. I find you terrifying." "Good." He gave me a smile that was all sharp edges. "You should be. I am terrifying. But I'm also being honest with you, and that's more than most people you know can say." You don't know the first thing about my life. I know more than you think. Victor finally took a bite. I know you've been at Sal's for 3 years. I know you send your aunt in Pennsylvania money every month, even when you can't really afford it. I know you cover shifts for Emma so she can take her brother to his doctor. I know you've been in pain every day for 4 years and never said a word. Honey, my blood ran cold. You've been watching me. I've been learning about you. There's a difference. That's not any better. Maybe not, but it's the truth. He put his fork down. I don't make investments without doing my research, Lena. And believe me, this is an investment. In what? In someone who might actually tell me the truth. We were quiet for a minute after that. The food was probably amazing, cost a fortune, I'm sure, but I hardly tasted it. I was too busy trying to piece together the man across from me. Victor Kane, a man who ruined lives with a phone call but paid for a stranger's surgery. He ran a whole empire on fear, but seemed to just want an honest conversation with a waitress. It just didn't add up. My turn for a question, I finally said. How did you get to be like this? Running things, controlling the city? People aren't just born into that life. Victor was quiet for a long time, and I couldn't read his face at all. My father worked in a factory, he said. 60-hour weeks for 30 years, making parts for cars he could never buy. When I was 15, the company moved everything overseas for cheaper labor, bigger profits. They gave my dad 2 weeks' pay and a handshake. He swirled the wine in his glass. He was gone 6 months later. Heart attack. All the stress, and we couldn't afford insurance. I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me something important. His voice was completely flat. No emotion at all. The world doesn't give you points for hard work or for being loyal. It only rewards power. So I decided I would get power. By hurting people. By protecting my interests and the people I'm responsible for. He looked right at me then. You stood between me and Emma. You put yourself in harm's way. Was that wrong? That's not the same thing, is it? We both make sacrifices to protect the things that matter to us. The scale is different, but the principle is the same. I wanted to argue, but deep down, what he said made a twisted kind of sense. You're trying to justify violence. I'm explaining how things are. Victor leaned back. In your world, things are simple, right and wrong, good and bad. In my world, everything is gray. Every choice has a price. Every decision means giving something up, and anyone who says otherwise is either a fool or a liar. So you just accept it? The violence, the fear, everything? I don't accept it. I control it. His voice was so hard back then, he truly believed it. Do you know what happens when people like me don't exist? He'd asked. Chaos. Worse people. He saw himself as a necessary evil, with rules. Of course, my first thought was his rule about threatening a 19-year-old girl. To his credit, he looked a little ashamed of that. He called it a negotiation tactic. Swore he wouldn't have really taken her. How was I supposed to believe that? You weren't, he'd said. That was the point. He sighed then, running a hand through his hair, and for a second, he just looked human. He said he needed S to understand consequences. But you're right, he admitted. It was cruel and unnecessary, which is why I paid the debt instead. Because I collapsed at his feet. Because you showed me something I'd forgotten existed. His gaze was so intense. Courage without calculation. Sacrifice without expectation of reward. It reminded him, he said, that not everyone was playing his kind of game. Just then, our main course arrived, something fancy with a French name, I'm sure. The waiter topped off our water glasses and disappeared again. Tell me about the accident, Victor said. I tensed right up. Why? Because I want to understand, he said. Because your leg is a part of who you are, and I'm trying to know who you are. I shouldn't have told him, shouldn't have given him anything real, but the way he asked was so direct, so genuine, The words just started to come out. I was 20, working 2 jobs, trying to save for nursing school. It was 3 in the morning. I was driving home from a warehouse shift when a drunk driver blew through a red light at Madison and 7th. Sometimes I can still see it when I close my eyes. I don't remember the crash itself. I just remember waking up in the hospital 3 days later. My mother was crying, and a doctor was explaining that while they'd saved my leg, I would probably never walk normally again. Just like that, nursing school vanished. The medical bills took everything we had: my savings, my mother's, money we borrowed from family that I knew we could never repay. I remember just staring at my dinner plate while I told him this. The other driver had no insurance. We sued, but he had nothing. So I learned to manage a limp and got a job at a diner. And for 4 years, that was my life. "That's not fair," he said softly. I looked up at him. "No, it's not. But you already knew that, didn't you? That life isn't fair." "Yes," he said, so quietly. After that, we ate in a silence that felt calmer somehow. They brought dessert, something with chocolate, and coffee that I actually drank because I had a graveyard shift starting in 3 hours. "The surgery is scheduled for 2 weeks from now," Victor said as we were finishing. "Dr. Chen will call you with the details. Recovery will take 6 to 8 weeks before you can start physical therapy." I told him I couldn't miss that much work. "You won't have to," he said. "I've arranged for your shifts to be covered and your wages to be paid." I set my coffee cup down very carefully. "Why would you do that?" I asked. "Because you can't heal if you're working yourself into the ground," he answered, like it was obvious. "The surgery is pointless if you can't recover properly." It was all starting to sink in. "You're paying for my surgery and my rent and my wages. That's a lot of money." He just nodded. "Yes, more than I should spend on someone I barely know." "Probably," he said, and his expression was completely unreadable. "But I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and you have something I can't buy. So, call it a fair trade." I had to ask, "What do I have that you can't buy?" "Authenticity." He said the word like he was confessing something. "The ability to care about people without calculating what you'll get in return. The courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything." He paused for a beat. "I want that in my life once a week, even if it's just for a few hours." As we stood to go, Victor stopped at the door and pulled out a business card with just a phone number on it. "This is my direct line," he said, handing it to me. "If you need anything, anything at all, call. Day or night, it doesn't matter." I was so stubborn then. "I don't need anything from you," I said. "Maybe not now," he replied. "But if that changes." The same car drove me home, but the city looked different now, like I was seeing it from outside my own life. When we stopped, the driver opened my door with that same quiet efficiency. "Miss Hayes," he said as I got out. "For what it's worth, Mr. Kane doesn't do this, any of it. You must be someone special." I didn't feel special. I just felt confused and like I'd walked into a story where I didn't know any of the lines. But when I was in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I kept thinking about what he'd said. About authenticity, about courage, and how he looked at me like I was something precious, not just ordinary and broken. It was a dangerous way to think, but it was also intoxicating. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of getting ready. Dr. Chen's office called with all the pre-op rules. Victor's people handled everything: my time off from work, the money to replace my wages, even my rides to the hospital. I remember Emma crying when I told her, hugging me so tight it almost hurt. "This is because of what you did," she said. "Because you saved me." "No," I told her. "This is because a very strange man decided to help me for reasons I don't entirely understand." But that wasn't completely true, was it? I think I understood more than I was admitting. The Friday before the surgery, I had dinner with Victor again. Same restaurant, same private room, The same careful conversation between two people from different worlds. Are you nervous? He asked. I didn't bother hiding it. Terrified, I told him. What if it doesn't work? What if I go through all this and end up right where I am now? His confidence was unshakable. Then you go through it again and again until it does work. He insisted Dr. Chen was the best, and if she couldn't fix it, he'd find someone who could. He spoke as if money could solve any problem, and in his world, I guess it could. Why does this matter so much to you? I had to ask. My leg, my pain, all of it. You barely know me. He was quiet for a long moment. Because when you collapsed at my feet and said you couldn't run, I saw something in your eyes. Not fear, not pleading, just truth. And it's been haunting me ever since. I remember thinking that was an odd reason to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm a strange man, he said, with a little smile that was almost apologetic. But I keep my promises, and I promised myself that if you agreed to this, to the dinners, to letting me into your life even a little, I'd make sure you got a chance to walk again, really walk, without pain. The surgery was on a Tuesday morning in a hospital so lavish it felt like a hotel. I had a private room with nurses who actually had time for me and a view of the city from 18 floors up. Dr. Chen came to see me the night before, talking me through everything and answering my questions until I ran out of them. You're going to do great, she said, squeezing my hand. I've done this procedure 47 times. You're in good hands. I really wanted to believe her. I woke up in the recovery room with my leg wrapped in bandages, and the pain medicine made the whole world feel soft. A nurse checked my vitals, and I think a doctor asked me questions that I answered without really hearing. And then, Victor was there. I blinked, trying to see clearly, absolutely certain the drugs were making me see things. But he was real, sitting in the chair by my bed in one of his expensive suits, looking completely out of place. You came, I mumbled through the fog. I said I would. No, you didn't, I remember saying. A small smile touched his face. I implied it. How do you feel? Like someone took my leg apart and put it back together wrong. That's more or less what happened, he said. But Dr. Chen says it went perfectly. Better than expected, actually. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Victor was up in a flash, adjusting my pillows with a gentleness that was so surprising. Easy. You just had major procedure. I remember asking him why he was there. His reason was simple. No one should ever have to wake up from something like that all alone. He sat down again, and I saw for the first time just how worn out he looked. He told me he just wanted to be sure I was all right. I mumbled something about his empire, and he just brushed it off, saying it would be fine for a few hours. I tried to say more, but that medicine was a powerful thing, pulling me back to sleep. My eyelids felt so heavy, no matter how hard I fought. Just rest. Victor's voice was so soft. I'll be right here when you open your eyes. And you know what? He was. Every single time I surfaced over the next 12 hours, there he was, reading his phone, making hushed calls, once even arguing in a quiet hiss with someone, James, I think, about some urgent matter. But he never left. The next day, when my head was clearer and the pain was just a terrible throb instead of an inferno, I finally asked him, "What is it you're really after, Victor?" He glanced up from his phone, his eyes meeting mine. "What do you mean?" he'd asked. I sort of waved my hand at the room, at him. No one does all this just for some polite conversation, you know. So, what was the real story? He was silent for a long time, and his face was more unguarded than I'd ever seen. I want to remember how it feels to be human, he said. I want to have a conversation with someone who isn't scared to be honest with me, who doesn't need my influence or my money, someone who just sees me as a man, not some monster. He stopped for a second. Is that so unbelievable? Yes, I said, because it was the truth. You are a monster. Hurting people is what you do. He never looked away. But maybe for a few hours, once a week, with you, I can pretend I'm not. It should have sounded like a line, like some kind of manipulation, but instead, it felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. Getting back on my feet was awful. Physical therapy was even worse. 6 weeks of exercises that left my legs burning, where progress was counted in tiny little increments. There were days I wanted to give up, days I thought I'd never walk right again. Victor would stop by twice a week, once for our dinner, and once just to see how I was. He never stayed long on those extra visits, just enough to ask how things were going, to listen to me complain, and to tell me it would all be worth it. "How can you be so sure?" I asked him once, on a really bad day when the pain had me in tears through the whole session. "Because I've seen people come back from far worse," Victor told me quietly. "Because you're so much stronger than you know, and because it's just not in you to quit." I told him he didn't know me that well. He said, "I know you faced me down with a shattered leg and absolutely no way to protect yourself. That told me everything I need to know about you." 12 weeks after the surgery, I took my first steps without any crutches. They were clumsy and they hurt, but they were mine. Dr. Chen actually teared up. The therapist was cheering, and I just stood there, putting weight on that leg and feeling something I hadn't felt in 4 years. It was hope. That Friday, I walked into the restaurant on my own 2 feet. I still had a little limp, favoring my good leg, but I was walking. No crutches, no cane, just me. Victor stood up the moment she walked in, and for a second, I saw this look on his face. It was almost like pride. "You're walking," was all he said. "I'm walking." I sat down across from him, and I couldn't help but grin. It's still sore, and I'm not all the way there yet, but I'm doing it. He just smiled and said, "I told you it'd be worth it." We had our meal, we talked, and for the very first time, it felt like I was having dinner with a friend, not cutting a deal with a demon. That feeling didn't last, though, because while I was busy learning how to walk again, his world was beginning to splinter, and I was about to be the one holding the hammer. The talk started quietly. I first caught wind of it about 3 weeks after I ditched the crutches. Little things, you know. The way people's expressions would change when I entered a room. How conversations would die out when I got close. The way eyes would follow me, a mix of curiosity and something that felt an awful lot like fear. At the diner, my regulars, people I'd known for ages, suddenly had trouble looking me in the eye. New faces would stare until I caught them, then look away. Even Marcus, who'd been with me through 3 years of late-night shifts, seemed different, wary, as if I'd become someone to handle with care. "What is going on?" I finally asked him one quiet Tuesday, catching him near the coffee pots. Marcus shot a look toward the tables, then back at me. "You honestly don't know?" "Know what?" He just sighed, rubbing his tired face. "People are talking, Lena, about you and Victor Kane." My stomach just dropped. "What are they saying?" "That you belong to him. That he's got you stashed away. That the surgery, these dinners, everything." He couldn't even say the rest. "It's not like that," I said, maybe a little too sharply. "We just have a meal once a week. That's it." "I know that," he said. "But folks see what they want. And they see a waitress who somehow got the attention of the scariest man in this city." Marcus kept his voice down. "Some think you hit the jackpot. Some think you're a fool. And some—" He stopped. "Some what?" "Some think you're a problem. Whether you're his problem or theirs, I don't know." I went back to my tables with this cold feeling spreading through my chest. I'd been so wrapped up in my own little world of recovery, in the joy of walking again, that I never stopped to think about how it all looked from the outside. A waitress who could barely make ends meet suddenly gets top-dollar medical care from a notorious crime lord. weekly dinners at fancy places. It was special treatment that just didn't add up unless there was something more to it, even though there wasn't. The whispers seemed to follow me home. I could feel people watching me on my walk to the bus, even when I couldn't see anyone. Then my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't know. It was just 3 words, but they chilled me to the bone. "You're being watched." I deleted it right away, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being a target all the way home. My Friday dinner with Victor started out just like any other. Same place, same private table, that same careful back and forth in our conversation. But I just couldn't relax. My mind kept replaying the rumors, the stares, that text. "You seem distracted," Victor noted, putting his wineglass down. "What's on your mind?" "People are talking about us. People always talk. They think I'm—" I couldn't get the words out. "They think I'm your mistress," Victor finished for me, as casually as if he were talking about the weather. "I'm aware. I've heard the rumors. And it doesn't bother you? Why should it? I know what's true, and you know what's true. What anyone else thinks doesn't matter." "It matters to me," I snapped back, a little harsher than I meant to. "I have to live in the real world, Victor. A world where your reputation counts, where people judge you by your company." "Then don't keep my company." He said it so flatly, but I saw a little flicker in his eyes. "You can leave at any time. I've said that since day one." "I don't want to leave. I want—" I couldn't figure out how to say it. "I wish this wasn't so messy." "Anything worth having usually is," Victor said, leaning back. "But if the gossip is bothering you that much, I can put a stop to it." "How?" "By making it very clear that you're under my protection, that anyone who bothers you, threatens you, or even speaks ill of you will have to answer to me." His tone was level, but there was an edge of steel to it. "It's a simple fix." "That would only make it worse. It would prove them all right." "Then tell me what you want me to do." I didn't have an answer for him. I wanted the surgery, and our dinners, and this strange, fragile friendship we were building. But I wanted it all without the baggage, without the risk, without being a target just for knowing him. I wanted something that couldn't exist. "I got another text today," I said softly. "From a number I didn't know. It said I'm being watched." And just like that, Victor's whole presence shifted. Casual way he had was gone, replaced by something sharp and cold. "Show me." I deleted it. "When?" "This afternoon, around 3. He took out his phone, typed something fast, then looked up at me. And honey, I'd never seen him look like that before. It was concern, and maybe even a little bit of fear. "I'm having James look into it. But Lena, I need the truth from you. Have you noticed anyone following you? The same car showing up? Someone in a place they shouldn't be?" "I don't know. Maybe. I thought I was just being crazy." "You're not crazy. You're being careful." Victor's jaw was tight. "This is exactly what I was worried about." "What do you mean?" "I have enemies," he said. "Powerful enemies. People who would be thrilled to find a weak spot they could use against me." He looked me right in the eye. "You're that weak spot now." Those words just hung there between us, and they felt like a death sentence. "I didn't ask for any of this," I whispered. "I know, and that's why I'm going to handle it." Victor stood up suddenly. "James will take you home. Starting tomorrow, you'll have security. 2 men, working in shifts. They'll keep their distance, but they'll be watching. You won't even see them most of the time. I don't want bodyguards. And I don't want you dead." His voice was flat. Final. "This isn't up for debate, Lena. Either you accept my protection, or we end this whole arrangement right now. Your choice." I wanted to argue, to say I could take care of myself, but I kept picturing that text message. "You're being watched." It was too real. "Fine," I said, "but just until you find out who sent that text. Until I'm sure you're safe. And that might take a while." The ride home felt completely different that night. James drove and, instead of his usual man, and his gaze kept darting to the mirror, like he was expecting someone to be on our tail. When we got to my apartment, he even walked me to the door, which was a first. Mr. Kane isn't taking this lightly, James told me softly. And neither should you. Stick to your routine. Don't go anywhere new. If anything feels off, even a little, you call this number right away. He gave me a card, but it wasn't Victor's usual number. It's our emergency line, open 24 hours. Someone will pick up by the third ring. You're making me nervous, I told him. Good. Being scared makes you cautious, and being cautious keeps you alive. I barely got any sleep that night, honey. Every little noise in the hall had me jumping out of my skin. Each car that drove by outside felt like it was watching me. I kept checking my phone, almost waiting for another message, but there was nothing. The security guys showed up the next morning. Just two men in plain clothes, driving a boring old sedan parked down the block. I only knew they were there because I was looking for them. To anyone else, they were just part of the scenery. At the diner, Marcus knew right away. "You've got a tail," he said, topping off the coffee pots. "I know." "Well," he said, "that's either a very good thing or a very bad thing. Can't decide." "Me neither," I told him. That first week with the bodyguards went by quietly. The men were professional, silent, and kept their distance. I almost forgot they were there. Almost. Then it was Friday again, which meant dinner with Victor. I'd never seen him look so awful. He was bone-tired, tense, and had dark circles under his eyes that told me he hadn't slept in days. We ordered our food, but neither of us ate. We just sat there in this heavy silence until I couldn't take it anymore. "Victor, what is going on? What's really happening?" He was quiet for what felt like a lifetime. "There's some unrest in certain circles," he finally said. "People are second-guessing my choices, my leadership. The whole thing with Sal didn't help." "Because you showed him mercy," I said. "Because I showed weakness," he corrected me. "In my world, sweetheart, mercy is a fatal flaw. Compassion is a liability, and liabilities get you killed." "So, what does this all mean for us?" I asked. "It means," he said, his expression grim, "that some of my own people think I'm losing my touch, and they see you as proof, and my enemies see you as a tool, a way to pressure me." "Then maybe we should stop," I said. "The dinners, everything. If I'm putting you in danger—" "You're not the one putting me in danger, I am." He leaned in closer. "I chose to help you. I chose to keep having these dinners, to let you into my life, even on the fringes. That was my call, my risk. I'm not backing down now just because things got messy." "Why not? It would be the smart thing to do." "Because," he said, and his voice softened, "for the first time in 10 years, I have something to look forward to that isn't just about business. Because these dinners, talking with you, just being near someone who wants nothing from me but my time, it's the only time I feel like a man instead of a weapon." He took a breath. "So no, I'm not leaving. Not unless you tell me to." I should have said yes, you know. I should have ended it then and there, to save us both from what was coming. But I didn't want to. In spite of the danger and all the whispers, I had started to cherish these dinners too. The way he listened, like my simple words were the most important thing in the world. "You know, honey, what I remember most about Victor back then was the respect he showed me. He never looked down on me, not once. He saw me as his equal, even though we came from completely different worlds. I remember admitting to him so quietly, 'I don't want you to walk away either.' And his whole face just seemed to soften. He told me we had to keep going, but with extreme caution, and that I had to follow every single rule his security man, James, set up for me. No excuses." "Okay," I said, but he was serious. "I mean it, Lena. These people, they won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me." I nodded that I understood, but I didn't. Not really. It took 3 days for it all to fall apart. It was a Tuesday night. My shift at the diner was supposed to be over at 11, but Emma got sick, so I stayed late to help close up. It was nearly 1 in the morning when I finally walked out the back into the alley where we all parked. The security guys were watching the front. I'd told them I'd use the back door, but I'd forgotten all about the schedule change. That alley was so dark. The main light had been broken for a week. My car was parked at the far end, and I was about halfway there when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. 3 men stood between me and the diner door. They weren't security. They were strangers, with hard faces and cold eyes, and they moved with a purpose that told you they'd done this before. Lena Hayes, the one in the lead said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I tried to run. I really did. But my leg, which was still healing and weak, just gave out after 3 steps. I stumbled and caught myself on a dumpster, trying to keep going, but they were much faster. A hand clamped down on my arm. I screamed and twisted, and that's when I felt something tear in my leg. The pain was just this blinding, white-hot explosion. I went down hard, scraping my hands raw on the concrete. "Don't make this difficult," the man said, pulling me up by my hair. "We just want to ask some questions about your boyfriend." "He's not my boyfriend," I managed to say. "Sure he's not." The man's breath smelled like old cigarettes and stale beer. "Victor Kane spends hundreds of thousands on a crippled waitress just because he's a nice guy. You expect us to believe that?" "I don't care what you believe." He hit me. It wasn't hard enough to knock me out, but my vision swam and my ears started to ring. My mouth filled with the coppery taste of blood. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, like he was explaining the weather. "You're going to call Kane. Tell him you need to see him tonight alone. And when he gets here, we're going to have a chat about territory and respect." "I won't," I said. He hit me again, and I tasted a broken tooth. "You will, because the alternative is we hurt you until you do. And trust me, we can make this last a very long time." My phone was in my pocket. That emergency number James had given me was burned into my memory, but my hands were pinned behind my back by one of his friends, and every time I struggled, my leg just screamed. "Okay," I gasped. "Okay, I'll call him." "Smart girl," he said, letting go of my hair so I slumped against the dumpster. "Make it convincing. Tell him you're hurt, that you need help, that you're scared he comes alone or you die." So simple, right? One of the others handed me my phone. My hand was shaking so badly I nearly dropped it as I pulled up Victor's contact. My mind was just spinning. There had to be some way out, something I could say to warn him without them killing me right there. The phone rang once, twice. Victor picked up on the 3rd ring, and his voice was sharp with worry. "Lena, it's 1 in the morning. What's wrong?" "I need you," I said. And I didn't have to fake the fear and pain in my voice because it was all too real. "I'm hurt. I'm at the diner. Please come." "I'm on my way. Are you safe?" The man was watching me, a gun now clearly visible in his hand. "No," I whispered. "And Victor, they want you to come alone." I hung up before he could answer. The man actually smiled. "Good girl, now we wait." They dragged me deeper into the alley, zip-tied my wrists to a drainage pipe, and faded into the shadows. Waiting, hunting. My leg was throbbing with my heartbeat, my mouth was full of blood, my wrists were already going numb from the plastic digging into them, and I'd just set a trap for the only person who had shown me any real kindness in years. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I tried to get my hands free, but the zip ties were industrial strength. All I did was scrape my wrists raw. I thought about screaming, but one of them pressed a gun to my temple and advised me to stay quiet unless I wanted to die before Victor even got there. So, I stayed quiet and waited. The sound of a car pulling into the alley made all 3 of them tense up. Doors opened, then footsteps, confident and unhurried. Victor walked into view, and my heart just broke. He'd come alone, just as they'd demanded. No backup, no security, just him in that expensive suit, looking calm and in control as he walked straight into an ambush. "Let her go," he said, his voice quiet. The leader laughed. That's not how this works, Kane. You don't give the orders here. I wasn't asking. Victor's voice dropped into a register that was cold and dangerous. Let her go, and maybe I don't kill all three of you. Big talk for someone who's outnumbered and outgunned. You think 3 of you is enough? Victor's smile was absolutely terrifying. You have no idea who you're dealing with. That's when I saw them, shapes moving in the darkness behind Victor. 4, 5, 6 men appearing from the shadows like ghosts, all armed, all moving with a deadly kind of grace. The security detail I'd thought was at the front. James appeared from nowhere, his gun already drawn. More men I'd never seen before materialized from impossible angles. The 3 kidnappers realized their mistake far too late. Drop the weapons, James said calmly. You have 3 seconds. They didn't. What happened next was fast and brutal, and nothing like you see in the movies. Gunshots echoed in the tight space. Men dropped. Someone screamed. It might have been me. It might have been one of them. Blood sprayed across the concrete. The man who'd hit me went down with a hole in his chest, his eyes wide with surprise. And then, it was over. Silence fell like a heavy blanket, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens that would arrive too late to matter. Victor was by my side in an instant, cutting the zip ties with a knife that appeared from nowhere. Are you hurt? Did they... My leg! I gasped out. I think I tore something when I fell. He lifted me up as if I weighed nothing, cradling me against his chest. James, clean this up. I'm taking her to Dr. Chen. The police will find 3 dead criminals who picked the wrong target. Victor's voice was pure ice. Make it look like a gang dispute. You know the drill. He carried me to his car, not the sedan I was used to, but something sleek and fast, and drove through the city with a controlled precision that felt more dangerous than speeding. I pressed my face into his shoulder, just shaking, trying not to think about the bodies in the alley, or the blood on my hands, or the fact that men had just died because of me. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. I should have called the emergency number. I should have... You survived. That's all that matters. His jaw was tight. This is my fault. I underestimated how far they'd go. Who were they? Competitors. People who think I'm weak, who wanted to prove it by hurting you. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. They were wrong. Dr. Chen was waiting when we arrived at her private clinic. She'd been pulled from sleep but looked completely put together. She examined my leg with a gentle efficiency while Victor paced like a caged animal. Torn ligaments, Dr. Chen said finally. Not as bad as it could be, but you'll need to stay off it for at least 2 weeks. Physical therapy will need to restart. She met my eyes. You're very lucky. If you'd put any more weight on it, you could have undone months of healing. Thank you, I managed to say. Dr. Chen bandaged my wrists, gave me something for the pain, and prescribed a rest that we both knew I couldn't afford. Victor drove me home as the sky was starting to lighten. When he pulled up to my building, he didn't let me get out right away. This can't continue, he said quietly. They came after you once. They'll do it again. So what are you saying? I'm saying you need to disappear for a while. I have a safe house outside the city, secure, protected. You'd be comfortable there until I can eliminate the threat. I can't just disappear. I have a job, a life. You almost died tonight. His voice cracked just a little. They would have killed you, Lena, slowly and painfully to hurt me, and there would have been nothing I could do to stop it. Then maybe we should end this, I said. The dinners, the arrangement, all of it. If being connected to you puts me in danger, it's too late for that. Victor finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my breath catch. You're already connected to me. Everyone knows it. Ending our arrangement won't make you less of a target. It'll just make you an easier one. So I'm trapped. You're protected. There's a difference. He pulled out his phone, pulled something up, and showed me the screen. This is the safe house. 20 minutes outside the city, fully staffed, secure. You'd have everything you need, and you'd be alive. I looked at the house on the screen. It was beautiful, isolated, expensive. A cage made of luxury and good intentions. What if I say no? Then I assign you a full security team. 6 men, 24/7 coverage, rotating shifts. They'll follow you everywhere. Work, home, the grocery store. You won't have privacy, but you'll have protection. Both options felt like losing, but honestly, I was losing a freedom model was a better option than being killed. The safe house, I said at last. But only until this is all done. Just until it's over, Victor promised. What he didn't tell me, and what I was slowly starting to figure out for myself, was that in his world, it might never truly be over. Problems didn't just vanish because you wanted them to. 3 days after that, I moved into what he called the safe house, with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like a lead weight. The place was just as he'd described, beautiful, comfortable, and locked down tight. There were staff who moved like phantoms and grounds that seemed to go on forever. I couldn't see the security, but I could feel it, always there. It was meant to make me feel protected. Instead, I just felt trapped. Victor would come by every few days to give me updates on the investigation, the danger level, how close they were to making things safe again. We'd have our dinners in the massive dining room there instead of our little restaurant. We'd talk just like we always had, trying to pretend it was normal. But it wasn't. I was beginning to understand that my life would probably never be normal again. 2 weeks in that house felt like 2 years. I'd spend my days just looking out the windows at gardens I couldn't walk in without an escort, trying to read books I couldn't concentrate on, and watching my phone as if a magical escape plan would just appear on the screen. My leg was getting better, slowly but surely, but the scars from that attack, the ones you couldn't see, ran so much deeper. I'd keep seeing the faces of those men, feeling the bite of the zip ties, tasting the blood in my mouth. And I kept seeing that moment Victor walked into that alley by himself, ready to give his life for mine. He came to see me on the 15th day, right as the sun was setting. He'd brought takeout from a Thai restaurant I'd mentioned offhand that I liked months before. We ate in that big dining room as a storm raged outside, the rain lashing the windows. "I have some news," Victor said, putting his fork down. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Who was it?" I asked. "A man named Marcus Vulov. He controls the territory on the east side. He's been pushing his luck for months, seeing how far he could go before I pushed back." Victor's face was a perfect mask of neutrality. Taking you was his move to prove I'd gotten soft, that I was more concerned with a waitress than keeping my empire in line. "What are you going to do?" "What needs to be done? What I should have taken care of months ago." He looked right at me. "I'm going to take him off the board for good." That last part just hung in the air between us. I knew what he meant. I'd known ever since I saw his men in that alley. But hearing him say it so calmly, so clinically, it made it real in a way I just wasn't ready for. "You're going to have him killed." "I'm going to neutralize a threat to my organization and to you, yes." "There has to be another way," I pleaded. "The law, the police." "The police won't touch Vulov. He owns half the department." Victor's voice was patient, but firm. "And even if they could, it wouldn't solve the problem. In my world, weakness is an invitation. If I don't respond to this with absolute force, every lowlife in this city will think they can use you to get to me. So more people are going to die because of me." "More people are going to die because of their own terrible choices," he said, reaching across the table and placing his hand over mine. "None of this is on you, Lena. You didn't ask for any of it. All you did was try to help a scared kid in a diner. That one act of kindness put you on my radar. Everything that came after that, that's on me." "But I stayed," I said. "I kept coming to dinner. I took the surgery, the help, all of it. I made choices too." "You made choices to stay alive. to heal, to walk again. Victor's hand tightened on mine. Don't you dare confuse your will to live with being guilty. We ate the rest of our meal in a thick, heavy silence. I wanted to argue with him, to find some moral high ground, but I was just so tired of pretending I didn't get it. I knew how his world worked. Every action had a reaction. Violence led to more violence. The only way to win was to be the most dangerous person in the room. When? I finally asked. Tonight. I'm leaving in an hour. You're going yourself? I have to. Sending someone else would be seen as a weakness. He got up and started clearing the plates, and it was so strangely domestic, coming from a man who ended lives for a living. It should all be done by morning, then you can go home. Just like that? Just like that. Once Vulov is gone, his crew will fall apart. His top guys will be too busy fighting each other to even remember you exist. You'll be ancient history. Victor paused at the sink, his back to me. You'll be able to get your life back. But there was something in his tone that made me stand up and walk over to him. What is it you're not telling me? He was quiet for a long time. There's something else. Something I learned while I was digging into Vulov's operation. What? Victor turned around to face me, and the look on his face was a mix of things I couldn't quite place. There was anger, yes, but also something that looked like pity. Your brother, Daniel Hayes, he worked for me 5 years ago. The whole room just seemed to tilt. What are you talking about? He was on a collections crew, down in the warehouse district. He was a good earner, very reliable, until he wasn't. Victor's voice was flat, controlled. He got greedy, started skimming. It was small at first, but then the amounts got bigger. By the time my people caught on, he'd taken almost $200,000. My knees felt like they were about to give out. I had to grab the counter to hold myself up. That's impossible. Daniel died in an accident on a construction site 5 years ago. I was at his funeral. Daniel died running from my men, Victor said, his eyes locked on mine. They chased him onto that site. He fell 4 stories trying to get away. The official report was changed to spare your family the truth. Your mother died never knowing what he was really involved in. You killed my brother. The words came out with no feeling at all. I was too numb from the shock. My men were chasing him, Lena, but he fell. It wasn't a hit. It was an accident that happened while we were trying to catch him. Victor took a cautious step toward me. I didn't know who he was back then. I didn't know he had a sister. I never put it together until I started looking into your past. When did you know? 2 weeks ago, right after the attack. I was going over the files of everyone who'd ever crossed my organization, trying to find a link to Vulov. 2 weeks, I said, my voice getting louder as the shock started to burn into pure rage. You've known for 2 weeks that you were the reason my brother is dead, and you said nothing to me? I didn't know how, he said. I was afraid. He paused, And I think he was just scared I'd finally see him the way everyone else did, like some kind of monster. I just wanted to scream, honey, to break something, to make him hurt the way I was hurting. It all came out at once, that my brother, my charming, wild Daniel, the one who promised he'd help with Mom's bills, was a thief. He'd stolen from Victor Kane, and he died running from it all. I never knew. I had to ask him, did he suffer? My voice just cracked. He said no, that it was over in a second, that he made sure of it. I could see him starting to fall apart right there. He kept saying he knew it didn't help, that nothing could change it, but he needed me to understand that he didn't know about me then. He said if he'd known Daniel had a sister, just trying to keep her head above water, he might have done things differently. Might have. He seemed so lost. He just ran a hand through his hair and said he couldn't change the past, only tell me the truth and hope I didn't hate him. And I told him I should. My voice was trembling, but I said it. I should walk out of here and never look back. He agreed. He said he'd have James drive me anywhere I wanted, keep me safe until this whole Volkov business was over, and then I'd be free of him. He asked, "Is that what you want?" And the answer just fell out of me, so raw and true. No. But it's what he thought he deserved. A life that wasn't tangled up with him and the violence that followed him. I just closed my eyes, trying to piece it all together. My brother was a thief. Victor's people had led him to his death. And yet, this was the same man who saved my life, who gave me the chance to walk again. To think, the man who'd become a real friend over all those Friday dinners was also tied to the biggest loss in my life. You'd think it would have been an easy goodbye, a clean break. But honey, nothing about us was ever simple. I told him I needed time to think, and he just said, "Take all the time you need." He walked to the door, and then he stopped. He said he was sorry. Not for what happened to my brother. Daniel made his own choices, you know. But for my pain. For my mother passing away without knowing the real story. For all the years I struggled by myself. He said he was sorry for all of it. And then he was gone. I just stood there in that ridiculously fancy kitchen he'd put me in, and finally, I just broke. I cried for Daniel and his foolish mistakes. For my mom, who died thinking her son was a hero. I cried for the girl I was before all of it, and for the future that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just sat by the window, watching the lightning, and wondered how many people had to pay the price for my life. All these men, with names I'd never even know, their fates tied to mine because I'd tried to save Emma. When the sun came up, my phone buzzed. It was a simple text from James. "It's done. Mr. Kane is safe. Volkov is no longer a threat. So clean, so tidy." It was a professional way of saying Victor had kept his promise. He'd taken care of the threat. I should have felt a wave of relief wash over me. But instead, I just felt empty. He didn't come by the next day, or the day after that. He sent James with food and updates, always asking if I needed anything. It was his way of giving me space. I see that now. Then, on the third day, Emma showed up. Seeing her there, I was so stunned I couldn't even speak. She was just fidgeting on the doorstep. I finally found my voice and asked her how she even got there. She said Mr. Kane had sent a car, telling her I might want to see a friendly face. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, taking in that mansion. She said, "This is where you've been?" I just told her it was temporary and let her inside. I asked her how she was, how the diner was doing. "Weird without you," she said, telling me Marcus kept asking about me. She followed me into the living room and sat on the very edge of a sofa, like she was afraid she'd leave a mark. Then she asked, so softly, if I was okay. She'd heard things, rumors about an attack, that Mr. Kane was involved, that people, you know. I just told her it was complicated. Everything was. She looked at me and said she wanted to thank me, for the diner, and for whatever was going on now. She knew it all started because I protected her. "This isn't on you, Emma," I told her. "Maybe not," she said, "but I can't help feeling responsible." She was twisting her hands in her lap. Then she told me Mr. Kane had come to see her. My heart just dropped. Why? To make sure she was safe, she said, and to offer her his help if she ever needed it. He also told her I was the bravest person he'd ever known. She looked right at me then. "He said you changed him, that you made him remember how to care about someone other than himself." He really said that. He also told her he'd never forgive himself if I got hurt because of him, that he was trying to make it right, but he didn't know if I could ever trust him again. Emma leaned in close. "What happened, Lena? What did he do?" And so, I told her everything. About our dinners, the surgery, the attack, and my brother. The awful twist of fate that connected me to Victor before I even knew his name. I told her about the choice I had to make. Walk away to be safe, or stay and love a dangerous man. Loving. She picked up on that one word I hadn't meant to say. "You love him?" I didn't know what to say. How can I love someone who's caused so much pain? Who can end a life as easily as I pour a cup of coffee? But Emma, bless her heart, she was always wise beyond her years. But he also saved you, she said gently. People aren't just one thing, Lena. They're messy. Maybe he was a monster, she said. But maybe he was also a man who was trying to be better, all because of me. That felt like too much to carry. Love usually is, she replied. She stayed for 3 hours. By the time she left, the world didn't feel quite so lonely. That evening, Victor came. He looked worn down to the bone, with dark circles under his eyes, and a tension in his shoulders that told me everything, a deep exhaustion from all the violence. But his eyes, honey, they just lit up when he saw me. It was only for a second before that guarded look he always wore came back. He asked me how I was. I told him I wasn't sure yet, and that we needed to talk. We sat in his living room with this big coffee table between us that might as well have been the Grand Canyon. I remember the rain had started up again, a soft tapping on the glass that matched my own nervous heart. I told him I'd been thinking about my brother, Daniel, how much I hated what happened, hated the choices he made, and hated that he was all alone and afraid at the end. Then I took a deep breath and said the hardest part, that I didn't hate him for it. You could see the surprise on Victor's face. He thought I should, but I'd spent the last 3 days really thinking about Daniel. I loved my big brother, but I had to admit I didn't know him as well as I thought. He made his own terrible choices and paid the price. I looked right at him and said, "You didn't kill him. Your men were doing a job. He ran, he fell. It was awful, but it wasn't a murder. He called that generous. I called it honest, which is what he'd always asked for. But then, I had to know. I needed the truth from him. No more games. I asked if he knew about Daniel when he first helped me, paying off that debt, the surgery. Was it all just some kind of payment for his guilt? He looked me straight in the eye and said no, that he hadn't known until 2 weeks before. He said he did all of it. The debt, the dinners, everything, because he wanted to, because I was different. He said it was because, for the first time in ages, he'd met someone who was brave instead of just scheming. Looking back, I think he saw a kind of courage in me I didn't even know I had. Finding out about Daniel, he said, just made him see how tangled up our lives already were. Whether it was destiny or just chance, he didn't know. But it was never about guilt. I just said, okay. And I believed him. It was a gut feeling, but it was strong. My second question was, what now? The bad guy was gone, the immediate danger was over. So, what was next for us? He said that was up to me. His voice was so careful then. He laid out the choice. I could go back to my old life, and he'd watch over me from afar. We could stop the dinners, end the whole arrangement, and I'd be safe. Or I could stay. Really stay. Not as some weekly appointment, but as someone who was truly in his life. Someone he wanted to protect because he couldn't stand the thought of not protecting me. He got up and walked to the window, watching the rain. He told me he knew what he was asking, all the danger and complications it would bring. That being with him would always put a target on my back. He knew it wasn't fair, but he asked anyway. My heart was just hammering in my chest. I had to ask why. And honey, that's when he turned around, and for the very first time, all his walls were down. What I saw was so real it almost hurt to look at. He said that somewhere between all the diners and doctors and Friday nights, he'd fallen in love with me. And he had no earthly idea what to do about it. The words just hung there. I got to my feet, my legs still aching, and walked right up to him. I could see the honest fear in his eyes, the worry that I would just turn and run. I told him, so quietly, that I didn't know if I loved him. I thought I might be starting to, but I was just so scared of what it all meant for my life. He told me not to choose him then, to choose myself, choose a simple, safe life. But I knew, even then, that a normal life wasn't really in the cards for me anymore. I remember reaching out and touching his cheek, feeling how tense he was. From that very first day I fainted in front of him, my whole world had shifted. I couldn't be that person I was before. So he asked me who I was now. I told him I was still trying to figure that out, but what I did know was that I wasn't ready to leave. Not then. Maybe not ever. That's when he pulled me into his arms and held me so tight, like I was the most fragile thing in the world. And I let him. For the first time in so long, I just let myself feel safe. I let myself wonder what it would be like to choose this complicated, dangerous man and try to build a life out of all that brokenness. He whispered into my hair that he couldn't promise me safety or a normal life, but he could promise to always be honest, to be loyal, and to protect me as long as he lived. And love, I added. The word felt so new on my tongue. He said yes, and more love than he thought he ever had left in him to give. We just stood there as the daylight faded, the rain washing everything outside. We were just two people from completely different worlds, you know, trying to find a way to meet in the middle. I knew more trouble was coming, but I finally felt like I was making choices, not just trying to survive. So I finally said, "Take me home." Not my apartment, not some safe house, but his actual home. I wanted to see his real life, not just the one he showed everyone else. He pulled away to look at me and asked if I was sure. I told him no, but I was going anyway. And then he smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and for a second, I saw the man he could have been in a kinder world, the man he still might become. We left that house that night, and I remember driving through the city as all the lights were just starting to glitter. He lived in a penthouse that wasn't flashy, just comfortable. He had amazing taste. There were books everywhere, art on the walls, and a big telescope by the window, pointing at stars you couldn't even see from the city. It felt like the home of a man who had everything, but was still profoundly alone. He told me he never brought people there, that it was his private space. So I asked him why he brought me. He said it was because I asked, and because he wanted me to truly see him. Not the crime boss, not the monster in the fancy suit, but just Victor, the person he was when no one was looking. I looked around that apartment again and saw it all differently. The books were about philosophy and history. The art made you think. And that telescope, it told me he was someone who still looked for the stars, even when surrounded by darkness. I told him softly, "I see you." And he wasn't what I expected at all. He was more human, and somehow that made everything feel so much more complicated. We stayed up talking for hours that night, about Daniel, about our pasts, and all the uncertainty of what lay ahead. We talked about the impossible mess we were in. He told me about his business, how he was trying to clean it up, to step away from the violence, to leave behind a better legacy. He said he'd spent 10 years building an empire, only to realize that empires are really just kingdoms built on graves. He didn't want that anymore. He wanted something real. When I asked him what that meant, he just looked at me and said, "This. Sitting with someone who challenges me, who sees the worst in me, and doesn't run away, who makes me want to be better." He reached out and touched my face so gently, then said, "Like you." I was so emotionally drained that I fell asleep right there on his couch. When I woke up, the sun was just coming in, and Victor was asleep in a chair nearby, a tablet sliding off his lap. He was still in his clothes from the day before. I just sat there watching this dangerous, complicated man who had somehow become the center of my world, and I had no idea what would happen next. The answer, it turned out, came 3 days later. James, his right-hand man, showed up with news. He didn't waste any time. He said one of the other boss's men had survived and was talking, saying Victor only went after him because of a personal issue over a woman. James glanced over at me then. He said the story was getting around, that people were second-guessing Victor's judgment, saying he'd gone soft over a girl. Victor just dismissed it, but James insisted it was serious. Three of his biggest partners wanted meetings to make sure he was still focused, that his relationship with me hadn't made him weak. That word, soft, just hung in the air like a threat. I remember the look on Victor's face. It was like steel. He told James to set the meeting for the next day, with all three of them together. He was going to make it plain that his private life was just that, private, and that I was staying with him, under his watch. That part, he said, was not up for debate. When James was gone, that feeling of being trapped crept back in. The quiet moment we'd had was over. You see, honey, that's what he was trying to warn me about. The true price of being with him. But I walked right up to him and said I understood. I wasn't going to run away this time. He told me I should be scared, and I was. But I was done letting fear run my life. Then I kissed him, the first time I'd ever started it. It was quiet and careful, saying everything we didn't have the words for. He looked at me afterward like I'd just hung the moon. I love you, I told him, and it was easier that time. I knew it wasn't simple or safe, but I chose him. He just pulled me in and held on so tight, as if I was the only thing keeping him from drifting away. And looking back, maybe I was. The meeting was in some warehouse in the industrial part of town, neutral ground. He spent that morning on the phone, his voice sharp and controlled. I just watched from the window, my mind racing with all the terrible possibilities. He told me for the third time I didn't have to go, that it was safer at the penthouse. We'd already settled that nowhere was safe, I told him, turning from the window. And if they were meeting because of me, to decide if our relationship had made him weak, then I needed to be there. I wanted them to see me, the real me, not some story they'd invented. He worried they'd use me against him, paint me as a vulnerability. Then you'll have to prove I'm not, I said. I went over and straightened his tie, though it was already perfect. It was a small thing, but it felt important. I reminded him that he wanted something real in his life, and this, fighting for us, was as real as it gets. I told him to show them that choosing me was the strongest thing he'd ever done. He took my hands and held them to his chest. I could feel his heart pounding. You're either the bravest woman I know, or the most foolish, he said. I even managed a smile. I learned from the best. We got to the warehouse an hour early. I remembered James and 6 other men securing the whole place, checking every corner. By the time the first partner showed up, Victor and I were standing together in the middle of that huge, empty space. We were putting on a united front, you see, making a statement before anyone even said a word. The three of them arrived one after another, these powerful men who ran the city's underbelly. Dmitry Klov, who had the ports, Raymond Torres, with his casinos and clubs, and Chenwei, who moved all the money. They all came with their own men, eyeing each other like wolves who had to share a kill, but all their focus landed on Victor, and then on me. So, Klov started, his voice thick with an accent and his eyes like ice chips. This is the woman who started a war. Victor's correction was instant, his tone polite but sharp as a razor. This is Lena Hayes, and she didn't start a thing. He explained that Volkov had chosen to attack someone he was protecting, and he had simply responded. Torres just laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. Respond? You leveled his entire crew over a waitress. That's not business, Victor. That's feeling, and feelings make men careless. Victor's voice never wavered. Feelings make men human, but make no mistake, my decision to handle Volkov was pure business. He broke the most basic rule of our world. He went after what's mine. If I had let that go, every thug in this city would think my people were fair game. Then Chenwei spoke for the first time, his voice soft but cutting. Your people. Is Miss Hayes one of your people, or is she something else? Because the whispers say she's become a liability. I felt Victor stiffen next to me, but I spoke before he could. I'm right here, I said. If you want to know who I am to Victor, you can ask me instead of talking about me like I'm a piece of furniture. All three of them turned to look at me then, and the weight of their attention was a physical thing. It was like being sized up by predators who were deciding if you were worth the effort. Bold, Clav said. I like bold, but it doesn't answer the question. What? Are you to him? A distraction? A weakness they can exploit? I kept my voice as level as I could, even with my heart hammering. I'm the person who reminds him why he built all this in the first place. Not just for the power or the money, but for the control, the ability to keep people safe who couldn't do it themselves. I told them how he'd shown me kindness when he didn't have to. Those choices, I said, those human choices, don't make him weak. They make him different from men like Volkov, who only understand violence. A nice speech, Torres said. But empires are built on fear, not mercy. And people are starting to wonder if you still command either. That's when Victor's voice sliced through the tension. Then those people are fools. For 10 years, I've held this city together. I've managed territories and kept the peace when it would have been easier to let it all burn. And I did it without becoming a monster who hurts innocent people to prove he's tough. Volkov crossed a line. I erased him. That's not weakness. That is the very strength that stops this city from consuming itself. But you did it for her, Chen Wei said quietly, pointing at me. That's the issue. A business call based on a personal feeling. How can we trust that your judgment isn't compromised now? Victor's answer was absolute. Because my judgment has never been clearer. For 10 years, every choice I made was cold, calculated, no attachments, no feelings, just logic, profit, and staying alive. And what did it get me? An empire built on fear. Partners who are only loyal because they're afraid of the alternative. A life where you trust no one and nothing matters but the next deal, the next threat. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. More open, more real. Lena changed that. She reminded me there's more to life than just power. That sometimes the right thing to do isn't the profitable one. And that protecting someone you care about is worth more than pretending to be untouchable. He looked at each of them. So yes, I took out Volkov because he came after her. And I would do it again. Not from weakness, but because I finally have something that's worth fighting for. If any of you have a problem with that, say it now. We'll handle it right here, and whoever is left standing will know where things stand. The silence that came after was the most dangerous I'd ever felt. You could feel the violence just waiting in the air. Chen Wei was the first to move. He stepped forward, his eyes sharp and clever. You've changed, Victor. That's clear. The only question is if it's for the better or for the worse. Better, Victor said, without a flicker of doubt. Ask anyone who works for me if I'm fairer now, more thoughtful. I haven't gone soft. I've become smarter. There's a difference. Show us, Torres challenged him. Prove this isn't all about the girl. Prove you can still make the tough calls. What did you have in mind? Torres took out a tablet and pulled something up for Victor to see. I couldn't see what it was, but I saw Victor's expression turn to stone as he read it. This is about Marcus Chen's business, Victor said, his voice flat. Your nephew. Chen Wei just nodded. He's been skimming from the top and selling information. By your old rules, he'd have to be dealt with, but he's family. So what would you do? It was the perfect trap, you see. Show mercy, and he was weak. Demand blood, and he'd lost his soul. There was no right answer. Victor looked at the tablet for a long time, then he looked at Chen Wei. What do you want to do? The question seemed to surprise Chen Wei. What? He's your nephew, Victor said. Your family. I'm asking you what you want the outcome to be. Because if this were just business, I'd say cut him loose. But it's more than that. So, what do you really want? Chen Wei was quiet for a moment, thinking it over. I want him to stop, he finally said. To learn his lesson, but I don't know if he can. Then let's find out, Victor said, handing the tablet back. Give him a choice. He can leave town with enough to start a new, clean life, or he can stay and try to earn back his place. But make it clear, If he betrays you again, there are no more chances. That's the business part. But giving him the chance to be better? That's family. And valuing both doesn't make you weak. Claude actually laughed then, a real laugh. You have changed, Victor. The old you would have demanded his head. About taking a man's life over a principle. Victor's voice was low when he said, "The old me built an empire on graves." He told them he was trying to build something new, something that would last. And lasting empires are built on more than just fear. They're built on loyalty and respect, and on the idea that people make mistakes and sometimes deserve a second chance. One of them, Torres, pushed back, asking what would happen if his mercy was seen as weakness, if others saw it as an opportunity. Victor just gave this sharp little smile and said he would remind them just how dangerous mercy can be when it's offered by someone who doesn't have to give it. "I'm not soft," he told them. "I'm strategic. There's a big difference, and anyone who forgets it will learn the hard way." The three partners looked at each other, a whole conversation happening without a single word. Finally, the main one, Chenwei, stuck out his hand and said he could work with strategic. He welcomed Victor back, the real version. The other two followed, and you could feel the whole mood in the room change. It wasn't friendly, not even trusting, but it was an understanding. They saw that he had changed but was still a man to be reckoned with. As they were leaving, Torres added one more thing. He asked if I was staying with him. Victor said I was. Torres warned him to keep me protected because others would see me as his weak point and would try to test it. Victor's reply was so quiet, so calm. "Let them try," he said. "They'll learn the same lesson Vulov did." After they were all gone, that huge warehouse suddenly felt so empty. I remember letting out a long breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. That was terrifying, I told him. He just said it was necessary and pulled me in close. I could feel all that tension just melt away. "You were perfect," he said. "Everything I told Emma about you making me better. I meant every word." And I knew he did. I leaned my head against his chest and asked him what we were going to do now. "Now," he said, "we live. Carefully, but together." Those first few weeks were a strange dance, learning how to be together in a life that was half in the shadows. I moved into his penthouse but kept my old apartment, just in case. I even went back to the diner, even though he hated the idea. I needed the normalcy, you know? Even with all the whispers from the customers. Emma was the one who said it out loud. "You look different," she told me one night. "Happier, scared, but happier." I asked her if it was possible to be both at once. She just smiled while refilling the coffee pots. "I think it's the only way to be, when you love someone dangerous." She asked if I was scared he'd hurt me. I told her no. I was scared someone would hurt me to get to him, or hurt him to get to me, or that it would all just crumble. "But you're staying," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm staying," I smiled back, "because somehow he's worth it." Victor started changing his business, shifting things toward legitimate companies, trying to leave the violence behind. It was slow, risky work. Every move he made left him open to his rivals. But he was determined. He was building it for us, he told me one night, while we were sitting on his balcony looking out at all the city lights, so that one day, maybe I wouldn't have to be afraid. I told him I'd always be a little afraid, and that was okay. It meant I understood what was at stake. It meant I wasn't taking a single moment for granted. About 3 months after that awful warehouse meeting, Victor called me to his office, his real one, downtown. I'd never been there. Walking through doors with his name on the glass felt like a dream. He said he had something for me and pulled up some files on his computer. He'd been working on it ever since the attack, ever since he realized how much danger we were in. "What is it?" I asked. It was a foundation, funded by his legal businesses. It was set up to provide medical care for people who couldn't afford it. People like I had been. People like my brother, before he went down the wrong path. Victor turned the screen toward me. I want you to run it, he said. I just stared at the screen. The bylaws, the mission statement. It was all real. It was a way to take all that awful money and turn it into something good. Why me? I whispered. Because you know what it's like, he said, taking my hands. You know what it's like to be invisible, to need help. You have more courage and compassion in your broken leg than most people have in their whole lives. Then he looked me right in the eye. And because I want to build something good with you, something that matters. That, my dear, changed everything. You know, he had this way of making everything sound like a business proposal. He suggested I spend my time running his new foundation instead of just making his coffee. He said it would bring me into his world, make it clear to everyone that I was with him. But then, he paused and said it would also give me back a sense of purpose, a way to help people, just like he'd helped me. I was skeptical, of course, so I read every single one of those documents. The foundation wasn't some front, it was real, with real funding, all designed to make a difference. It felt like a ghost of the life I'd wanted before my accident took everything away. Of course I said yes, and the smile he gave me then, it was unguarded, not his usual one. I was hoping you'd say that, he told me. The foundation started up 6 months later, with me as the director. I'll never forget our first case, a single mother whose little boy needed a surgery she couldn't afford. It was an operation that would let him run and play, to just be a kid. I actually cried when I signed the approval forms. Victor was watching me, and he said so quietly, "This is what it feels like, using power for good, not just control." I'd forgotten. And I told him, "Then remember, every time you face a hard choice, every time your world gets dark, remember this. You are more than all that violence." He kissed me then, right there in our tiny office, surrounded by all those files of people who needed a second chance. I felt something settle in my heart that day. It was the final step in accepting us. Not perfect, not even safe, but we were real, and we were trying. A year after I'd first collapsed at his feet in that diner, we were at the foundation's anniversary party. It was a small thing, just staff, a few volunteers, and some of the families we'd helped. Emma was there with her brother, who was so healthy then, thanks to a treatment we'd funded. Marcus from the diner came with his wife. Even Dr. Chen showed up, giving me this smile filled with a quiet kind of pride. "You've changed a lot of lives," Dr. Chen told me, "including your own." I remember just shaking my head. "Victor changed mine first," I said. "I'm only trying to pay it forward." "You're doing more than that," she insisted. "You're building something that will be here long after we're gone." She looked over at Victor. "And you've changed him too. In all the years I've known him, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." I had to ask her, "How does he look at me?" And her answer, it's stuck with me ever since. "Like you're the answer to a question he'd stopped asking. Like you're home." Later on, back in the penthouse, Victor took me out onto the balcony, the place we'd had so many of our serious talks that year. The whole city was spread out below us, a sea of lights and stories. "I have something for you," he said, and he pulled a small box out of his pocket. My heart did a funny little jump. I stammered, "Victor, it's not what I think it is. Or maybe it is, but just not yet." He opened it, and inside was a key. It was simple, silver, but you could tell it was important. "It's to a house outside the city," he explained. "Far enough away that we could just disappear if we ever had to, but close enough for an emergency. I bought it 6 months ago. It's a real safe haven, a place we could start over if this all came crashing down." I asked him, "Why give this to me now?" "Because," he said, looking right at me, "I want you to know you always have a choice. You can stay in this life with me, the foundation, the risks, all of it. Or, if, wreck. The foundation would keep doing its thing, and Victor's businesses were slowly getting on the straight and narrow. Dangers would always be there, of course, Life was still a messy, risky, wild ride, but now we were in it together. About a year later, Victor asked me to marry him for real, with a ring and everything, and the words he used just made me bawl. I said yes in a heartbeat. We had a little wedding, with just the people we knew we could count on. Emma was my maid of honor, and James stood up there for Victor. And when we said our vows, promising to stick by each other no matter what, I realized I'd been so wrong about something huge. I really thought my life had ended that night I fell apart in the diner. I believed my whole world would just be this tiny, painful place forever. But that wasn't an ending at all, you see. It was just the start. The start of finding out that I was so much more than my broken parts. The start of learning that being brave didn't mean you weren't scared, it just meant you did it anyway. It was the start of finding love where I never thought I would, with a man who'd built a kingdom on fear, but was trying to build a new legacy on something better. 5 years into our marriage, I was standing in the foundation's new building, a proper facility with operating rooms, physical therapy gear, and a whole team that believed in helping people the world had given up on. I was watching a young girl take her first steps after a big surgery, her therapists cheering her on with every little wobble. Victor came up right beside me and took my hand. "Look familiar?" he asked. "Only every single day," I said, squeezing his hand. "That girl who couldn't run." Well, honey, she was running the whole operation now, in a manner of speaking, of course. "Metaphorically," he chuckled. "Well, my leg's not too bad these days. Dr. Chen says I'm at about 94% function, and that's as good as perfect to me." "You were always perfect," Victor said, pulling me closer. "Broken leg and all." "You're a liar." "I'm honest. Big difference," he whispered, kissing my temple. "Ready to go home?" "Always." We left the foundation arm in arm, my walk even and sure now, his hand resting on my back. The city was all around us, just as dangerous and complicated as ever, filled with those dark corners that always try to snuff out the light. But we had learned how to walk through those shadows side by side. And as we drove home, back to the penthouse and the life we'd pieced together from impossible decisions and unexpected kindness, I thought about that night in the diner. I remembered falling at his feet and whispering those 3 little words that changed my whole world. "I can't run." I was wrong, wasn't I? I could run, I could walk. I could stand tall all on my own and face whatever was next with a strength I had to earn back. But the wonderful, amazing part was that I didn't have to do it alone anymore, because I'd found someone who would always stand with me. He'd shown me that real kindness, real mercy, could be the most powerful weapon there is. Not because it's soft, but because it can turn monsters back into men and broken girls into fighters. He was the man who picked love over power, and it turned out to be the bravest thing he'd ever done. And the two of us, we were building something neither of us could have dreamed of that night when our worlds fell to pieces. We were building a good life, you know, a love that was worth the fight, and a future that showed us that sometimes the toughest stories really do have the best endings. Not because life gets easy, but because you earn them, one brave little choice at a time. It becomes too much. You can always use that key. Go start over somewhere new. I'll make sure you're set up and safe. I won't even come looking for you unless you ask. I remember taking that key from him, feeling how heavy it was in my hand. "You just let me go?" I asked. "I'd let you choose, every single day. That's what love is," he told me. Giving someone the freedom to walk away, and just hoping they want to stay. I closed my hand around it, and then pulled him into a kiss, one that was quiet and deep and held everything I'd learned about love that year. That it was messy and scary, and took more guts than I ever knew I had. That it was about choosing your person, day after day, even when you knew all the ways it could break your heart. And that sometimes, the most courageous thing to do isn't to run, but to just stay put. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him, our faces close. "Not today, not ever. Not unless one of us wakes up and decides this isn't worth it anymore. And if that never happens, well, I guess we're stuck together." I smiled then. Forever sounds both terrifying and absolutely perfect. It does, doesn't it? Victor said, resting his forehead on mine. I never thought I'd have this. Someone who sees all of me, the good and the bad, and still chooses me anyway. Someone who makes me want to be a better man without trying to change who I am. I never thought I'd walk right again, let alone next to someone who saw me as strong instead of fragile. I took a little step back, just testing my leg like I sometimes did back then, making sure it would hold me. We're both full of surprises, I said. We just stood there for a while as the sky grew dark around us. Just two people from impossible worlds who had somehow found something real in all the. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community